Our first guest speaker is Barbara Pribble. Barbara is the Reserves and Resources Manager for Santos. She's worked for over 25 years as a geologist in managing reserves and resources in the Australian oil and gas industry. Not only that, she's also, as we said earlier this morning, she sits on the PRMS, Petroleum Resource Management System Working Group, and she also is on a UN working group around the UN Framework Classification System, which I don't think many people would have seen. So today's presentation will be quite interesting to talk about how those things, and also JORC, maybe fit together in a more modern context. So with no further ado, I'll pass over to Barbara.
Thank you, Tony, and thank you to the GSQ for inviting me along today to talk about resource classification. And in fact, this talk is an extension of one I gave a couple of months ago at the Australian Geoscience Council Convention in Adelaide, which was a really interesting and ambitious conference, and also an extension of a talk I gave last year for PISA, but it's been updated to where we are now. Okay, and really it's looking at how resource classification systems have evolved, where we are today, and where we think they're going to head in the future. So let's just get a bit of a history lesson to go back to what the problem was. And the problem was that there was ambiguity in communication of mineral and petroleum resources in how you quantify them and their project maturity. And there was also there was also complexity to that system, how to distill what are complex scientific issues into plain English. And the dapper gentleman on the right there, Dr. Vincent McKelvey, who was the chief geologist for the US Geological Survey last century, in fact, was very skilled at distilling those complex scientific issues into plain English, and he came up with the box that you see on the bottom right there, which became known as the McKelvey box, and it was a simple device for visualising the levels of uncertainty and risk relating to the categorisation and classification of resources. And it, in fact, is the precursor for all the resource classification systems we use today. So resource assessment, why do we do it? And it's for investment decisions. Petroleum reserve and resource assessment helps us quantify uncertainty and qualify risk. It's generally a project-based approach where the project represents the link between the petroleum accumulation or any resource accumulation and the decision-making process. And it usually assesses three key parameters: the geology or the static parameters, the recovery or the dynamic parameters, and the commerciality aspects. And it's critical on both the supply and the demand side. It's the foundation on the supply side in feasibility studies and on the demand side for gas sales agreements. And who are the principal stakeholders? Well, they include governments to manage natural resource endowments sustainably and for policy formulation, for the industry to provide data and information necessary to employ technology management and finance, for customers and users to ensure certainty of supply, and to the financial community to allocate capital appropriately. So how has it changed? So in the past, for petroleum, you were mainly looking at conventional petroleum accumulations, where generally there was much lower risk and high margins. And issues like social and environmental were just emerging. Today, we've expanded that to include unconventional petroleum. We're now dealing in an environment of much higher risk and lower margins, and issues like social and environmental are maturing. And where do we see this going? We see this being expanded to all petroleum and energy sources. We see diversity and integration with other industries for us to survive, and issues like social and environmental will get embedded in those systems. So let's just take a look at the Petroleum Resources Management System framework first, which is the foundation resource classification system for petroleum. It's the most commonly used worldwide. And basically, it's a two-dimensional system where the axes represent the range of recovery from any project outcomes and certainty of path to market. It's generally divided into three main classes where reserves are the highest and they've satisfied a commercial test. You have contingent resources, which are discovered or known accumulations, but they're not ready or able to satisfy a commercial test just yet, and there could be a number of reasons for that. Prospective resources, which still have a discovery risk as well as a development risk. And this system is what's accepted, certainly in Australia, for ASX resource reporting petroleum resources. The currency of trade for this system is generally focused on the 2P, which is the proved plus probable, but the 1P or the proved may be used for contracting and for decision making as well. And the framework that you see in this system, or the whole system, was actually updated in 2018, in July, and it replaced the version that came out in 2007. So a little bit more detail. Not only do we have those axes, but we also have sub-classifications, and that's meant to assist entities in resource management. And this is where reserve and resource projects are sub-classified according to their maturity level and the actions required to commercialise them. When you can't define a project, then they revert to unrecoverable and you're just capturing the in-place volumes. So we just mentioned that PRMS has just recently been updated, and that was on the back of a 5-year process looking at updating that system. It took a long time, and there were plenty of lively discussions as part of that update process, trying to get agreement on the level of detail required for that system. Was quite a difficult balance, as you can imagine. But that's the new document there. Some of the key changes, of which there's quite a number of changes and clarifications, but some of the key ones to note are that proved reserves must now demonstrate positive economics. So you can't report a 1P unless it's economic in its own right. It did clarify some of the tests that are required to remove from contingent resources to reserves, and obviously one of those is demonstrating a high likelihood of development. It does now allow consumed in operations or fuel gas to be reported as reserves, but it has to be reported separately. And it does recommend those use of subclasses, and that's particularly important for contingent resource projects where you can get anything ranging from resources that are very close to commercialising to reserves to that which is a long way from commercialising. There's also going to be some examples and guidance notes published by the SPE, and they'll be put on the SPE website. And if you're interested in this system and the new update, I can direct you to the SPE website where this can be downloaded for free, and it also has some explanatory notes. But now I want to move on to some new ideas, and what I'm going to be talking about is the United Nations Framework Classification. And the main aim of the UN system is that it should contribute to the creation of a new communication language which is understandable by all parties concerned, namely state, society, business and the investor. It's structured within the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, which relate to the economy, society and biosphere, and it's meant to consider all of those. It's around balanced development. It's trying to take into account issues about rising population and increasing urbanisation, rising investments in the development of energy, of new energy and raw material projects. Important to note that sustainable energy will need $1.25 trillion per year if we're going to achieve it, which is 3 times current levels. The system is trying to link social and economic imperatives at both a global, regional, national and local level. and it's trying to be a unifying standard for the classification and management of all resources. So the aim of that system is around long-term policy making and planning. It has some shorter-term actions to make resource projects competitive through innovative approaches. It allows for the efficient financial capital allocation. It's designed to reduce the environmental burden and the carbon footprint and negative public perception of resource projects. It's also meant to increase collaboration globally, and it's a numerical system independent of language. So whereas PRMS and JORC are two-dimensional systems, the UN system is a view in 3 dimensions, and those dimensions are geological knowledge, the G-axis, project feasibility, the F-axis, and socio-economic viability on the E-axis. This system is applicable to all sectors and all commodities. It embeds all project risks and opportunities. It helps provide a balanced view of socio-economic factors, technologies, and all the uncertainties involved in the classification of resources. It puts the emphasis in figuring social and environmental considerations at the centre of resource management. So if we just touch on the environmental social factors, and while these are embedded in all systems like PRMS and JORC, the UN is trying to bring them sort of front and centre in how we classify resources. So it's looking at environmental issues, and that's obviously the impact on or changes to the project area and its surrounds. The social impacts, so the results on of the project on humans and society, and that's stemming from both environmental changes, so health issues, as well as changes in social systems and structures, including traditional land usage. It contemplates formal contingencies, they're the legal and regulatory processes we work under, and also non-formal contingencies. So these could be local community concerns and organisations who have an interest in how these projects are going to be delivered. These are obviously ones that are much harder to determine how to classify. The documents on the right are draft guidelines in these matters that have been released by the UN, and in fact there's a pilot project underway at the moment that the UN is undertaking to classify the petroleum projects in Mexico using this system and putting more emphasis on the social and environmental factors. That pilot project will be made available once it's completed. So the UN system has evolved over the years from initially being for solid fuels and minerals. In 2009, it got expanded to oil, gas and uranium. In 2016, it started contemplating renewable energies, largely geothermal and injection projects. In 2017, it encompassed bioenergy. 2018, anthropogenic resources. And then looking forward to 2020, it's going to be integrating all renewable resource classifications in there as well, things like solar, wind and hydropower. So there's again a pilot study underway in New Zealand at the moment looking at how to integrate solar into that system. So it allows governments in policy making to compare, say, a coal project to a gas project to a solar project on the strength of what are the risks and what are the range of uncertainty and outcomes for those projects, and try and put them in the same framework and compare them on the same level. So what it's trying to do, and what we're all trying to do now, is to deal with the quadruple bottom line. So what is that? Purpose. We want to provide energy. We want to do it profitably, that is economically. We want to do it being mindful of the planet and be environmentally responsible. And we want to take account of people, that's socially and ethical accountability. So this is where we see the regulatory and reporting trends going. So we see a trend towards increasing reserves disclosure, ethical accountability generally, and a stronger push to the use it or lose it principle. You can see on the right there an extract from the Weekend Australian from a couple of months ago, Matt Canavan there saying, use it or lose it to the gas firms. We have increasing trend with how we report reserves. So the Queensland Government, which we've heard talked about today, currently requires the 6 monthly reporting of 2P only, but it's moving to best or good industry practice guidelines issued this year, looking at all reserve and resource categories, and some of those will likely be embedded as mandatory requirements in the coming years. In 2013, we had the ASX disclosure rules and guidance coming out for all public reserves and resource reporting for petroleum and minerals, and it required the sign-off by a qualified person. Now, the ASX is currently doing a review of those disclosure requirements in light of the PRMS, which has been issued this year, and will likely come out with a transition period for companies to come into compliance with that system, and may indeed change the regulatory rules on the strength of it. And some of that may be around things like disclosure of those project maturity subclasses, which we referred to earlier. We had the ACCC inquiry into gas supply, with a view to improving market transparency and information disclosure on reserves and resources in response to the federal government on gas market concerns. Some of the recommendations from that report included using a common pricing assumption for evaluating reserves. Consultation on that process will begin this month. So and already where companies are having to provide information to the ACCC about more information about their reserves and resources. So there's definitely an increasing trend for more disclosure in that regard. And so we expect that we'll continue to evolve in response to all those factors into the future. Thank you.